Welcome to Simplify Science Lecture 3.3, Do the Locomotion with Me. We have a quote from Richard Dawkins. At the deepest level, all living things that have ever been looked at have the same DNA code. It's interesting how connected we are. So our learning goals for this lecture. Students will be able to understand the characteristics of animal-like, plant-like, and fungus-like protists. We're talking about protists. We're going to discuss the variety in the kingdom Protista. What we already know is the differences between bacteria and are prokaryotic, meaning they lack membrane-bound organelles and a nucleus. They're so small they don't need that level of organization. We already knew that all living things contain DNA, or some kind of genetic material, a nucleic acid, and that all living things work to adapt to their environment and maintain homeostasis. In the lab, we looked at locomotion of different kinds of protists, how they're able to move around, how they achieve it in different ways. We saw movement through flagellum, we saw movement through cilia, and we saw movement through pseudopods. Each of them, very different than the next one, really. So protists are very diverse. They're eukaryotic, meaning they have membrane-bound organelles in the nucleus. So they have that level of organization because they're so large. Even though they're only single-celled, they can be quite complex and quite varied. These are all real images of different kinds of protists. It gives you an idea of what we're talking about here. They have characteristics. Some of them are kind of animalish, and some are plantish, and some are fungi-ish. And so we sort protists into those three different categories, depending on what the protist has some similarities to. But all protists are eukaryotes. The animal-like protists are heterotrophs. Hetero meaning other, and troph meaning food. So their food comes from other sources. They eat things. They consume other creatures. They are not animals, though, because all animals are multicellular, and these protists are single-celled. So they're not actually animals. They just have some similarities to animals. The plant-like protists are autotrophs. That same word troph in there because that means food. Think of like a food trough. Auto, though, means self. So the food comes from themselves. In this case, we're talking about photosynthesis. It's the same process that we see happening inside of plants. Now, while these protists are plant-like because they can do photosynthesis and they have chloroplasts, they are not plants, they are protists because they lack roots, stems, leaves. They're not multicellular, they're single-cellular. They're not actually plants, they just have some characteristics like plants, such as being autotrophic. The fungus-like protists are heterotrophs, but they decompose dead organisms. That still counts them as heterotrophs, though, because they're still getting their food from other sources. Now, it's this decomposition that makes them kind of fungi-like. However, they're still not fungi because they still have some fundamental differences, one of them being locomotion. Protists are motile, meaning they're capable of moving around in their environment, whereas fungi typically are not. Here's a developing question. What is something that all protists have in common? A good example would be that they're all eukaryotes, which means all these different membrane-bound organelles, the most famous being things like a nucleus, having a cell membrane is true of all cells, having mitochondria. These are things that protists have. There are more answers. A proficient question. Why are the three categories, animal-like, plant-like, and fungi-like, helpful? And why can't they be used to indicate evolution? Pause and think about that. Prepare your answer. Well, they're helpful because they give us a reference point of something to compare them to. They give us some ideas to group them together with like categories, so it gives us a basis of discussion. Why can't they be used to indicate evolution? Is because this is something that we call convergent evolution. There may be more than one evolutionary pathway that ends up with the same kind of response, with the same kind of trait. There's not necessarily one pathway that evolves the same kind of thing. If we talk about an example that's maybe more familiar with us on a larger scale, something like flight. Like insects have evolved the ability to fly, and so have birds, but the structures and the methods they do it are different. They've evolved in different ways, but they've evolved towards the same purpose, flight. A mastery question. Why do you think some people argue that protists should be classified into more than one kingdom? Well, Kingdom Protista is a little bit challenging to wrap our heads around because there's so many different things going on. There's a lot of variety and subgroupings that it make it tempting to cut it up into smaller groups. Let's look at animal-like protists in depth. So, animal-like protist movement. These protozoans have different ways of moving through environment. Some of them have a flagellum, which is the whip-like structure we've seen on several creatures. Some of them have a pseudopod. The pseudopod's kind of interesting. There's this extension of the cytoplasm. It's kind of like part of the cell membrane is pushed out and it kind of gushes out in that direction like a fake foot and kind of drags the rest behind. We also see cilia. These are short hair-like structures, and they kind of swim by or kind of grab around and kind of crawl, you can think like. There's a whole bunch of them all moving together as one. They're different than the flagellum. The flagellum is one large whip that's whipping around, whereas the cilia have all these tiny little ones that are each moving on its own to get a net movement for the whole protist. Animal-like protist disease. The vast majority of protists do not affect humans. Most of them have nothing to do with us. There are a very small percentage of them, it's just like bacteria, that are pathogenic. Malaria would be one example. The protozoan Plasmodium is transferred to a human host whenever you're bitten by a mosquito. Mosquitoes carry them. And some mosquitoes are developing resistance to insecticides, and Plasmodium protists are becoming resistant to the anti-malarial drugs. Malaria is, definitely a problem in some parts of the world, so much so that over 1 million people die. Let's look at some plant-like protists in depth. So there's many species of these single-celled plant-like protists that live together in colonies. So we've been saying that these are single-celled, and it is true, but some of these are colonial. So they group together in these huge bunches, but they're still individuals that are kind of part of a whole. So they're kind of multicellular, but it's different than like you and I as humans being multicellular, where all of our cells work together to make a large different organism. In this case, it's all the same cell, all doing the same thing. They're just all doing it together as one big colony. So it's a little bit different. These photosynthetic plant-like protists form the base of aquatic food chains, and this is huge, they create half of the Earth's oxygen. They're very important producers in the food chain. So some examples to give us the look at the diversity. The euglenoids, these are euglenas. They swim with the help of a flagella. They have something called a pellicle. This is an adaptation they have. It's a coat-like covering on the cell surface that allows the protist to change shape. I don't know what it is about the euglena. I find them kind of cute. Look at these dinoflagellates. These are mostly marine plankton. They have two flagella that work together, resulting in kind of a spiral movement, a little bit more graceful than we've seen for some of them. Some of them have a stiff plate-like armor that goes around the cell, and maybe more interestingly, some of them are bioluminescent, meaning certain chemical reactions they have that go in within a cell can produce light, and so they glow. We also have these guys, which are just beautiful. They're called diatoms, and they're kind of algae that's covered in these glass-like shells. That's kind of their external skeleton. Uh, the one place that you might have seen something like this is ancient diatoms that are have died would leave behind these glass-like shells. They get ground up into a powder called diatomaceous earth. Let's look at these fungus-like protists then. So one example is the slime mold. Kind of strange little creatures. They're these plasmodial slime molds. It's a single mass. They're all clumped up. It creeps along the ground and it gains nutrients from decaying matter. So another example of ones that are colonial. These are individual cells that have bounded together with, their friends. Cellular slime molds live in soil as single cells, but when the food decreases, that's when the cells bound together and become this lump. The method of communication they have is interesting, and it's definitely something we'd like to learn more about. It's definitely a source of study. Water molds are interesting. We're looking at a picture here of a water mold decomposing a dead insect. Most of them are decomposers, but some of them can be parasitic. And like other protists, some of them reproduce asexually and some reproduce sexually. Let's look at a developing question here. Why would a protist need to move? Well, there's lots of reasons protists might need to move. They might be leaving an area that's dangerous, whether because of the environment or because of a predator, or they might be moving towards a food source or towards a source of energy. They might be moving towards the light. It's a method they can respond to their environment, respond to stimuli. Here's a proficient question for you to think about. So you can see what's happening is this protist is using its pseudopods not only to creep forward, but to creep around. And it's engulfing this other protist. So by using its pseudopods in this way, it's going to engulf and eat or digest this protist. It's hunting, is what it's doing. Here's lastly a mastery question. Can you create a food chain or pyramid that includes protists? And then think about what would happen if they were removed. All right, if you've unpaused, obviously there's a lot of different answers to this question because of the different kinds of protists. If you included a plant-like protist in your answer, would have been near the beginning. A producer using light to make energy. It starts a food chain or a food web. If you had an animal-like protist that's hunting other microorganisms, it would be somewhere in the middle there, consumer. And if you were talking about a fungus-like protist, it would be towards the end as a decomposer, breaking down that energy. The removal of any of them, would have problems with the food chain, particularly the ones at the beginning and the end, though, my producers and my decomposers. But any loss in the food chain is problematic.